Okay, welcome to the first video lecture for Chapter 1. This is the first of what's likely going to be 2 video lectures for this first chapter. I'll go maybe about halfway through, then we'll stop and have a second video lecture for the second half of the chapter so that each video lecture is not overly long. This first chapter is obviously going to be an introduction to, the broad field of evolutionary biology. It's going to give you sort of an introduction to the history of the development of evolutionary theory with Charles Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, some of the important players in this, and generally give you an idea of some of the early concepts about how evolution might work and compare and contrast those a little bit. And then at the very end, we'll talk about how, at least a little bit, how modern concepts of heredity and genetics were tied into Darwin's theory of evolution in the early 1900s to basically give us our modern theory of evolution that we rely on today. So, evolution is the unifying theory of modern biology, okay? Charles Darwin proposed in The Origin of Species that all living organic beings which have ever lived on this earth have descended from some one primordial form. And that's a direct quote from The Origin of Species. And the important point about evolution being the unifying theory of biology is that it ties everything together. Biology is an immensely diverse and enormous field. And trying to understand it all is very, very difficult. That's why we have so much specialization in biology. But evolution is a unifying concept because it sort of pervades all this diversity of biology and ties all these seemingly disparate concepts in biology together, which makes it possible to understand questions or answer questions such as, why insects all have 6 legs. There's a good evolutionary reason for that, and evolution explains that. Why do invertebrate animals vastly outnumber vertebrates? Why does a protein have a particular shape? Why are there distinct races of humans, for example? Evolutionary theory explains that very satisfactorily. Why are some people effectively immune to certain diseases while others are not? Evolutionary theory helps us to understand that. Why is a particular species found in Asia but not the Americas, for example? Evolution explains that. Why does the predator feed only on a certain type of prey? Why do seemingly useless or harmful characteristics, for example, the appendix in humans, exist? Evolution helps us to answer all these questions. In fact, a famous evolutionary biologist, Theodosius Dobzhansky, once said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." So look at the bat here, for example. The bat is a collection of very specific and highly evolved adaptations, such as wings, echolocation, and many other things. The question is, when you look at something like this, is how does one explain the existence of these sorts of adaptations, these sort of specialized tools that organisms possess that help them deal with their environment or help them to survive in their environment? Well, the answer is that you must first understand the difficulties that organisms face in their environment, what we call selection pressures, and the pattern of descent from ancestral forms. So if you think about the problems, the selection pressures that organisms have to deal with in their environment, and you think about the pattern of descent from earlier ancestral forms of those organisms, then you can explain those adaptations. All right, so let's talk about biological evolution here, okay? So what biological evolution is. It is change in characteristics of organisms through time. Sorry about the tapping noise with the Apple Pencil, it is what it is. So biological or organic evolution is change in the characteristics of organisms through time. All right. What it is not, right? What it is not. Change in individual organisms over their lifetimes. All right. It is also not change in non-living things, such as stars, rocks, planets, whatever, right? So the first point, what biological evolution is, right? Changing characteristics of organisms through time. This is referred to as descent with modification. Let me write that. Descent with modification. This is actually how Darwin defined evolution. For a long time, Darwin did not use the term evolution. He preferred to use this phrase, descent with modification. This process, descent with modification, evolution, if you will, is a process that occurs at the level of the population. It's actually populations that evolve. The characteristics of populations change from generation to generation. Individual organisms do not evolve, right? So back down here to what evolution is not. It is not change in individual organisms over their lifetimes. The change that we see in individual organisms over their lifetimes, going from a fertilized egg, a zygote, to an embryo, to a fetus, to a juvenile organism that's been born or hatched, that then grows and develops into an adult. That kind of change is referred to as ontogeny, right? That's developmental change. That is not evolution, okay? So just making some fundamental distinctions here. All right, now, evolutionary changes are changes that occur within a population that can then be passed on to subsequent generations, right? Changes can accumulate or not, they don't have to, in a population over time. And this is what we refer to as descent with modification or evolutionary change. And evolutionary change does encompass a broad continuum of change. So, some examples of evolutionary change. Antibiotic resistance. We've all heard of antibiotic resistance. Certainly now with the COVID pandemic that we're all dealing with, this is something of particular concern. Antibiotic resistance is something we've been aware of for quite some time. Basically what happens here is that you have a population that's being attacked by, let's say, some bacterial species, and we develop an antibiotic to try and knock down that disease. Well, there's going to be variation, genetic variation in the population of that pathogen causing that disease. And while the vaccine or antibiotic may work very well on knocking down a large portion of the population of the pathogen, there are likely going to be some individuals in that population who, because of their genetic makeup, just at random, have an increased measure of resistance to that particular antibiotic. They may be even effectively immune to it. So if the antibiotic or vaccine wipes out, let's say, 95% of that pathogen population, but 5% survives, you have to ask yourself, who is left in that bacterial population to survive and reproduce and make the next generation? The 5% that does survive. The 5% that has a genetic mutation, let's say, that makes them resistant to the antibiotic. And so they go on and reproduce. Everybody else dies off because of the antibiotic. The next generation, all the individuals of the next generation are descended from that 5% who survived because they were resistant. And the 5% that were survived passed on that resistance genetically through heredity to the next generation, and now nearly everyone is resistant. That is natural selection in a nutshell, and that's what antibiotic resistance is all about. So here in this figure, you see an example of this. This is increase in use of penicillin class of antibiotics in a Finnish population between 1978 and 1993 to treat ear infections. And so what you see on the primary y-axis on the left is the prevalence of the resistant bacteria. So what percent of the population of bacteria are resistant? That's our red line. And then over here on the right, on the secondary y-axis, the measure of drug use volume. So how much of the antibiotic is being used at any given moment. So what you see is that we start off with an initially very low frequency of resistant bacteria. But as that, eventually we start to see that spikes up, and along with that we see an increase in the use of the antibiotic, trying to keep that population that's resistant knocked down. So you see we have an increase in resistance. Here we had a new formulation of the drug, and you see it was effective briefly for 1 or 2 years in knocking down the population of the resistant bacteria, but then they evolved or adapted to it and started to take off again. And so you see that you have an ever-increasing use of the antibiotic to try and keep the population of bacteria in check. But what's happening here is that the antibiotic represents a selection pressure. It's an adversity in the environment that the bacteria have to deal with, and they adapt to it because of random genetic variation. And eventually, you end up with an antibiotic that's really no longer effective. And that's the case with penicillin today. You don't see it being used all that much anymore because so many of the bacterial strains that it used to be used against have evolved and adapted to it. And really, they're not affected by it much anymore. So we've had to shift over and create new vaccines, or I'm sorry, not vaccines, but antibiotics. Okay, so let's talk about some ideas of things prior to Darwin regarding evolutionary change. So Western views on the nature of life were rooted early on in a belief in the literal truth of biblical creationism, especially prior to the 19th century, the 1800s, and in particular the mid-1800s. The Enlightenment of the 18th century, the 1700s, caused the literal belief in biblical truth to begin to erode or give way. The literal belief in biblical creationism is the idea that God created all species. There was what was referred to as a scala natura, a scala natura. And this was called or referred to as a ladder of life, that species are produced, they are permanent and unchanging, since if they're changing, that sort of suggests that there might be a need for them to change to survive or a need for them to improve. And how could anything that God produced not be perfect from the very beginning, right? So this idea of the scala natura, this idea of the literal belief in biblical creationism, sort of preempted any evolutionary ideas, because evolutionary ideas suggest that species change. Well, if God created species, why would those species need to change? Because they'd be perfect from the get-go. Okay. Now, with the Enlightenment, starting in the 1700s, the 18th century, we had things like Newton's theory of physics. We had new ideas about astronomy, the origin of stars and planets. We had new ideas being developed about geology, for example, that the Earth is very old and has undergone dramatic changes. We start to see evidence emerging that species do go extinct. For example, in the fossil record, there appear to be species in the fossil record that no longer exist. So with the Enlightenment, especially the scientific Enlightenment, we start to see a lot of evidence developing that sort of flies in the face of this literal belief in creationism. Okay. All right. A couple of really important people who, especially with regard to geology, were important in sort of, guiding or molding Charles Darwin's ideas about evolution. There were two scientists, one named James Hutton and one named Charles Lyell. Well, James Hutton and Charles Lyell were really important for developing this idea that's known as uniformitarianism. Okay, uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism basically states that processes that are now operating, like geological processes, volcanism, mountain building, erosion, weathering, that sort of thing, plate tectonics, Uniformitarianism says that these sort of processes that we see operating now also operated in the past. And so we should be able to explain past geological processes by observing the same processes today. Okay, that's the idea behind uniformitarianism. Why was this important? Because this helped us to understand that not only is the Earth very old, but the Earth is a very dynamic and changing place. All right. In particular, James Hutton, who, by the way, was a Scottish doctor with a keen interest in geology, based on his geological observations in England and Scotland in the 1700s, late 1700s, he introduced the idea that the Earth is very old. It's far older than 6,000 years. So Hutton said that the Earth is older than 6,000 years that the Bible says the Earth is. Okay, that was a key takeaway from Hutton's work, right? Just based on traveling around Scotland, England, and looking at geological formations and that sort of thing, he deduced that the Earth is actually far older than 6,000 years. Charles Lyell, who was doing his work in the early and mid 1800s, and a little bit later even, is today considered the father of modern geology. Okay. Importantly, Lyell said that the Earth is a very dynamic place. It's changing, right? It changes constantly. A good example of this, look back on Google Earth, and in Google Earth you can go back and Google Earth Pro anyway, you can look at earlier satellite images from the 1990s, 1980s, whatever. If you do that and you go back in time in that way and you look at the coastlines of Indonesia, for example, prior to December of 2004 when the Indonesian tsunami hit, and then compare those images to what you see in the coastlines today, you'll see dramatic changes in those coastlines due to that tsunami. That's just one example of how the Earth changes over time, but it's due to geological forces. All right. So Hutton and Lyell were very important because together they basically said the Earth is far older than 6,000 years and it's a very dynamic and changing place. And these two ideas were sort of rolled into this concept of uniformitarianism, which again says that processes that we now see operating across the globe, geologic processes, for example, also operated in the past. As a result of that, we should be able to explain past geological processes by observing the same processes today. That means that we can understand why the current continental landmasses are in the positions that they are, because we can sort of deduce how they must have changed in the past, because we know that the same processes causing them to move today have operated in the past. It sort of ties the present into the past and the past into the present, which is so important for understanding why the Earth changes. And very importantly, if the Earth is old and the Earth changes, then not only is there time for evolution, more than 6,000 years, there's also a reason for evolution. A changing Earth means species will have to adapt and change with those, and adapt to those changing conditions. So Darwin took this idea of uniformitarianism, combined with the idea of an old Earth and a changing Earth, and ran with it and used it to explain why species might change and how they might change. All right, another very important scientist of the day, 1700s in particular, well, late 1700s, early 1800s, was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Okay, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. So Lamarck was a French naturalist, and he was actually the first to propose a mechanism for evolutionary change. Charles Darwin gets credit for evolutionary theory, but really that's only because he was right. He got it right. He explained why evolution occurs satisfactorily. He was not the first to suggest that evolution occurs. Neither was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who I'm talking about here. There were people prior to that in the 1700s. Even Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, who had suggested that evolutionary change occurs. The reason why we remember Charles Darwin is because he was one of the first, not quite the first, maybe the second, I suppose, to suggest a mechanism for evolutionary change, how it might happen, but he was also the one who got it right. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who I'm talking about here, was the first to try and really explain how evolution might occur. So he gets credit for that. Turns out he was really dead wrong in terms of his explanation for the mechanism of evolution, why it happens, but he should get some credit because he was the first to really try and explain it. Other people before him just said, well, evolution occurs, and they washed their hands of it and didn't go any further than that. Lamarck was one of the first to really try and explain it. His explanation or mechanism for evolutionary change is what he called inheritance of acquired characteristics. Inheritance of acquired characteristics. Oops, I missed a C there, misspelled that. Okay, so inheritance of acquired characteristics. What Lamarck was saying here is that individual organisms are born, and then throughout the course of their lifetimes, they acquire characteristics that they were not born with, characteristics that make them better at dealing with their environment, but again, that they weren't born with, and then they're able to pass on those acquired characteristics to their offspring. Okay, so Lamarck's idea was this. He famously tried to explain this with the analogy of giraffes. So Lamarck said that you have a population of giraffes, and the giraffes are, one of the main things that they're trying to deal with every day is getting food, and they eat the leaves off of acacia trees in Africa, for example. And so giraffes, an individual giraffe, any given day, is constantly straining, reaching up, trying to stretch its neck to reach higher and higher limbs of the acacia tree to get more food, to get more leaves. And through this sort of use, right, exercising its neck, so to speak, its neck would get longer from one day to the next, gradually, very slowly. And so as an adult, as an older adult, it now has a longer neck than it did as a younger adult, right? Once it stopped growing, its neck got longer because it was constantly trying to reach these higher branches, which allowed it to maybe compete better and get more food. And so that longer neck represents an acquired characteristic. Then that giraffe goes and reproduces and has offspring. And as adults, those offspring also have longer necks as a result of that. So Lamarck is saying that the giraffe acquired a longer neck as an adult through use, right, exercise, and then passed on that longer neck to its offspring. Now, maybe that doesn't sound so crazy, but think of it this way. Here's the same thing, just in a more dramatic example that should open your eyes to why this doesn't make much sense. Let's say that a person, an adult, who has two arms, like normal, is involved in a car accident. And in that car accident, loses their right arm, okay? Then goes on, has children, and all of his children are born missing their right arm. That's inheritance of acquired characteristics. Now, when you put it in those terms, you see how sort of crazy this sounds, okay? There's no biological basis for the inheritance of acquired characteristics in that way, in the way that Lamarck meant it. So in Lamarck's view, species don't originate from common ancestors, but are generated spontaneously and subsequently evolve up what he called a scale of organization, or a chain of being, okay? So Lamarck was saying that species are created independently, which is in line with old Earth creationism, okay? He's saying that there's no relationship among modern species. They're all independently created, and they evolve up the scale of organization and become more complex through inheritance of acquired characteristics until we have the species that we see today. All right, now, let's take a look at that and compare it to Darwin's ideas, okay? So here on the top, we have Lamarck's theory, so to speak. So we have time going from early times to modern times along the x-axis, and we have scale of organization, so from simple to complex. So Lamarck would say that a species would be independently created by God or something else, and through inheritance of acquired characteristics, generation to generation, it becomes more and more complex. And so it becomes more complex over time, going up the scale of being, the chain of being. Then a second species is created sometime later independently. It also evolves up the scale of being. becomes more complex, and a third species, and a fourth, and a fifth, and so on. You see how all the species are created independently and all evolve independently from one another. All right, so there's going to be a constant sort of spontaneous generation of the simplest forms. Each one evolves over time, becomes more complex. So you can look today and you can see some species that are very complex, some that appear very simple. The simpler ones should be younger, and the more complex species should be older. Well, that was basically Lamarck's idea, okay? Darwin gave us a very different view of this. Darwin's idea is a variational concept of evolutionary change, where species are related to one another through common descent, right? Descent with modification. Darwin would say, and did say, that you'll have a common ancestor located sometime far back in time, and it eventually begins to split into different lineages. Different populations split off from each other and evolve along their own trajectories as they each adapt to their own unique set of environmental circumstances, right? They're each adapting to unique environments. And so this means that species branch off, and what you get is sort of a bush-like appearance or a tree-like appearance, an evolutionary tree, if you will. This diagram that you're seeing here is what's called a phylogeny, an evolutionary history, okay, an evolutionary tree, a phylogeny. All these species that we see at the tips of the trees, tips of the branches, are extant or currently existing, currently living species. And if you go back far enough, you can see that these two species are related by descent from a common ancestor. This species, this one, and this one are related by descent from this common ancestor. All of these are related by descent from this common ancestor, and all of them ultimately are related by descent to this one common ancestor furthest back in time. And these little tick marks here represent major evolutionary changes, like going from 6 digits to 5, or loss of a tail, or whatever, right? And so this contrasts quite differently from Lamarck's theory. Lamarck's theory says that all species are created independently, and therefore of the modern species you should see no relationships among them. Darwin's theory says all species are created by and descend from a common ancestor, so they should have things in common. And in the same way, individual siblings of a family should have features in common with their parent. That's the idea. Okay, so let's talk about Charles Darwin. So Darwin obviously is considered to be the father of evolutionary biology. Darwin was born in 1809 and he died in 1882. He studied medicine at Edinburgh University in Scotland, and initially he had intentions of becoming a doctor like his father. His father was a fairly well-known and wealthy doctor in London, England, and Darwin, initially wanted to go off. Well, there's evidence he didn't really want to go off and become a doctor, but he was facing pressure from his family to do so, as people back then did. But he went to Edinburgh, spent about a year or two at Edinburgh University studying medicine, and there's a famous story about what actually turned him off of medicine. Back then, students in medical schools would attend these sort of surgeries, these open surgeries, where you'd have these big round rooms with seating that would rise very high, and down the bottom, the pit, so to speak, you'd have an instructor, professor, or a doctor doing a surgery and talking about what he was doing, and the students would watch. Well, Darwin was in one of these one day, and the doctor was performing a surgery on a child. And this was back, 1829, 30, something like that, maybe 28. And there was no anesthesia. And all Darwin says in his autobiography, which I've read, is that the surgery went badly. So you can imagine it must have been a horrific thing. And he was so horrified by that, it turned him off medicine permanently, and he left. He left Edinburgh University and never went back. He then subsequently decided to attend Cambridge University, where he completed his degree. He actually had planned on a career in the clergy at that point, but then went ahead and finished his studies. He did actually end up studying for the ministry and completing that degree, But that's what a lot of things. That's one of the things about Darwin that a lot of people who think he's this big boogeyman and don't like Darwin or his ideas will never tell you about him or don't even know, probably, is that he has a degree in divinity. But anyway, he did not become a clergyman. He had family contacts, particularly with his uncle, Josiah Wedgwood, and his father, that helped him to land a position as a ship's naturalist on the HMS Beagle. Now, the story is very long and convoluted how that happened. But basically, this sort of opportunity to go as ship's naturalist on the Beagle, which was originally slated for a 2-year voyage, survey voyage around the world by the British Admiralty, how he landed that position. And so imagine, you graduate with your college degree, you're young and unfettered, don't have a family or spouse or anything, nothing tying you down. Somebody offers you a 2-year sailing voyage around the world. I imagine you'd probably take it. I would. And he did. Charles Darwin did. And he had a consuming interest in natural history. He had, for years been an avid insect collector, hunter. He was an outdoorsman. Back then, people didn't have iPads and the internet and things to keep them inside. He actually went outdoors as a child and played. Anyway, so he had very strong observational skills as a result of all this. He had a very avid interest in nature, very avid interest in geology and botany and entomology, or study of insects. And so he jumped on this opportunity to go on the HMS Beagle on this round-the-world voyage at a time when that was not something that was easy to do. You couldn't jump on a 767 and go around the world in a matter of 24 hours. It was a major commitment and a potentially life-threatening commitment as well. So in 1831, Darwin leaves London on the HMS Beagle, and the Beagle circumnavigates the globe. And on this trip, which actually turned into a 5-year voyage, he gets back in 1836, Darwin had the opportunity to see a diversity of ecosystems, habitats, species that no other naturalist of the day had seen in relation to one another. Yeah, you had naturalists who could leave London and go to Africa and spend all their time in one spot in Africa studying the flora and fauna there, or going to South America and spending all their time studying flora and fauna there. Because it was so difficult to get around the planet, they pretty much did what they did in one place. They got to know one place very, very well. But they couldn't compare what they saw in one place to the next because they hadn't been to the next place. It was very difficult to do that. Darwin's in a unique position. He is, at the end of 5 years, he has seen all these different habitats, ecosystems, and so on and so forth, in connection, in sequence, and could compare them to one another when no other naturalist of his day had ever had that opportunity. And during that trip, he collected thousands of specimens of plants, animals, fossils, all of which, along the way, he is shipping back to London for his friends and connections at Cambridge and that sort of thing to collect and curate for him. He has a botanist friend, an entomologist friend, an ornithologist friend who are all collecting his specimens and keeping them for him so that when he gets back, he can study them. Okay. So let's take a look at his voyage here. So starts off here in London and basically spends the first 2 years of the trip mostly along the east coast of South America. This is about 2 years of the trip right there. Stops off at a lot of different islands along the way. The ship would stop in a port of call. Darwin and some of the sailors would jump off the ship with their collecting gear and roam around through, the forests, the woodlands, the mountains for weeks on end, and meet the ship in the next port of call, get back on, and so on. And like I said, Darwin would ship all of the stuff that he had collected back to his friends and colleagues in London. But this part of the trip alone took about 2 years. Rounded Cape Horn, which was a life-threatening endeavor of the day and still is today to some extent. Went up the west coast of South America, famously stopped at the Galapagos Islands, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which are right there on the equator, 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador. Spent about 4 weeks in the Galapagos, then went down through the South Pacific, around Tasmania, south of Australia, up through the Indian Ocean, back around the Cape of Good Hope, stopped off at South America again, and finally back to Great Britain. And this all took about 5 years. Again, 1831 to 1836. All right. So that was Darwin's voyage. So you can sort of get a feel for what different kinds of habitats and ecosystems and flora and fauna he's sort of seeing and able to compare in sequence relative to each other. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the Galapagos Islands in particular. So the Galapagos Islands are an archipelago 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador, like I said. They're a volcanic archipelago, which means that they're produced by what's called a hotspot. A hotspot is a thin section of the Earth's mantle under which there's a lot of superheated liquid rock called magma. And this magma breaks through the mantle and the crust of the Earth and spews up through a volcano and produces an island. Okay? And because the crust or the plates of the crust are moving over top of that hotspot, when the volcano erupts, it produces a mountain or an island, and then it stops for a while erupting. The plate moves over top the hotspot. Later on, the hotspot erupts again, produces a new volcano or a new island, which is now in a different place than the one before. The previous island had just moved away from it. If you look at the Hawaiian Islands today, they're stretched out over thousands of miles of the Pacific Ocean, and the hotspot is currently under the large island, the big island of Hawaii, where Kilauea is. That's currently erupting and has been since 1983. But the islands that stretch off to the northwest toward Japan, sort of culminating in Midway Island, halfway between Japan and Hawaii, those are all produced earlier in time by the same hotspot. But the crust has moved over that hotspot, and now we have the hotspot producing the big island of Hawaii. So that means that these islands that you see here in the Galapagos and also the Hawaiian Islands are of different ages. And they also have variable plant communities and different climatic conditions. Variable plant communities partly because of their different ages, okay? And so the difference in plant communities results in differences in the faunal or animal communities, and these are all largely, in good part, a measure of differences in their ages. All right, also some climatic differences as well. But one of the important points about these islands, as is often true with a lot of islands, is that there's a lack of predators, right? You don't have any predators, and this is why you often see the evolution of flightless birds, for example. And Darwin saw this on the Galapagos with the Galapagos cormorant. So he's on an island here in the Galapagos and he's seeing a flightless bird. Well, how does that happen, right? How does a bird lose the ability to fly? Well, if there are no predators around, there may be no need to fly to escape them, and flying is very expensive metabolically and energetically to maintain those powerful flight muscles and the high metabolic rate that's needed and all that sort of thing. In the absence of predators, it may no longer make sense to maintain the ability to fly. It might be easier to lose it. And so these are things that Darwin's observing that are starting to make him think about or question, how these kinds of adaptations might come into existence. Okay, so here we see, for example, the island of Fernandina. This island is currently being produced. It's the youngest of the 14 main islands in the Galapagos. As you go east, the islands get older. And so these islands over here are very tropical, lush, covered in vegetation. Isabella and Fernandina and some of these others on this side are very desert-like and scrub-like and have much more difficult environmental conditions. So this means that the animals and plants that live on these different islands deal with very different conditions. That's an important point to remember. And it's also important to realize that these islands are only 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador, which is over here to the east. And that's the closest land mass, South America. So Darwin recognized, he had just come from South America, he recognized that the animals and plants that he's seeing here in the Galapagos strongly resemble animals and plants he had just seen on the mainland of South America. And that's because the animals on the Galapagos came from South America. And they landed on these islands, are, subject to very different conditions, and they start to evolve and adapt to these very unique conditions. So while they're similar in some ways to the animals and plants he had seen on South America, or that continent of South America, they're all also becoming very different because they're adapting to the local conditions on each of these very unique islands. So he's starting to question, he's starting to see evidence that species are changing and do change and aren't static and constant like Lamarck thought they were, for example, or at least independently created. Some examples of what Darwin saw: finches and tortoises. So Darwin collected specimens of the Galapagos finches, which are really famous because of his visit there, from various different islands. He went to 4 different islands, collected specimens of the finches from each of the 4 islands that he went to, and because he was not thinking really in terms of differences in populations of finches at that time from different islands, he assumed they were all the same species and didn't write down which islands he had collected which specimen from. But now he's starting to look at them while he's on the ship after collecting them, and he starts to realize they have different morphologies. Morphology is form, overall anatomical form. Different beak morphologies, for example. So he had to go back and sort of reconstruct his collection notes, from his collection notes, where his specimens had come from, where he had collected them from, because he realizes now they're different from different islands. He also noticed that the large land tortoises on the islands were different based on which island they came from. They had different characteristics, primarily in shell morphology, form of the shell. And so Darwin is now starting to see evidence that species that you might think are all one might actually be different depending on where you collected them from. And so he's starting to get the idea that populations of organisms may be in some way altered by the environments in which they're found. Different environments produce different types of alterations, what we call adaptations. So he's now starting to see evidence of change or adaptation to a local environment. Okay. All right. So, Darwin also noticed, go back for a second, he also noticed that during the voyage that living species tended to resemble fossil species found in the same region. So up to this point we've talked about how he's looking at living species and comparing their differences based on where they came from or where they live. But he also has a very big interest in geology and looking at fossils and that kind of thing. And so he's also noticing that that living species tended to resemble the fossil species he's finding in the same area, in the same region. So this sort of combined with the evidence like the finches and the tortoises eventually lead Darwin to think that modern species had evolved from common ancestors. If you have ancestral species in the fossil record that currently don't exist, or at least you don't see them around, but they in very striking ways resemble the modern species, the logical conclusion is that the modern species are descended from those ancestral species that are now present only in the fossil record. They evolved from them, right? That's the idea. So these are the kinds of things that Darwin's seeing that other naturalists of his day had never seen. They had never seen this and therefore couldn't put 2 and 2 together. Now, Darwin is on this 5-year voyage. Again, they go back to London in 1836, late 1836, and Darwin's father dies a couple years later, I believe late 30s, and Darwin inherits all his wealth. So Darwin's family wealth then allowed him to work full-time on his biological studies. He collected tens of thousands of specimens over this 5-year voyage. It's all there waiting for him when he gets back to London after the trip is over. And he spends the next 20 years as a gentleman scientist, working full-time, compiling evidence, studying his specimens, collected during the voyage, and that sort of thing. Now, he's seeing evidence for change. Okay, he saw it on the voyage. He's seeing even more of it when he starts to look at his specimens when he gets back to London and starts working on all this, but he has no idea what it is that might be causing this change to occur. Well, in 1838, he takes a break. Summer 1838, he takes a break from his studies, and he decides to do some reading. He reads a book called On Population. On Population by Thomas Malthus. And Malthus was an English economist, and Malthus was sort of, investigating the role of famine, for example, on human economics. And Malthus, in On Population, had proposed that society always encounters famine because human populations grow faster than our food production capacity. So we basically outstrip our resource base, and there's always some fragment of the population that's sort of left out in the cold and doesn't have enough food, and that's why we constantly have this problem of famine, which, as you know, we still have today. Well, Malthus basically proposed that, through proposing this idea that we constantly have this sort of selection pressure humans do in the form of famine, sort of working on our population, that led Darwin to realize that resources in the environment are always limiting, right? Food is limiting for humans. It's a resource, but it's limiting. And so that, combined with what Darwin had seen in terms of biology over his years on the HMS Beagle and that sort of thing, which is that individuals will produce more offspring than will survive, and that individuals vary in their characteristics. Think about the finches and the tortoises and that sort of thing. This led Darwin to the idea of natural selection. So Darwin reads On Population by Thomas Malthus, and he realizes resources are limiting. He already knew that individuals will produce far more offspring than will survive, typically, and that individuals, even related individuals, will vary in their characteristics. This led him to the idea of natural selection as the driver of evolutionary change. Okay, so let's go back and talk about this idea that individuals produce more offspring than will survive. This may not be abundantly clear if really you're just paying attention to humans. Humans have a very low infant mortality rate, especially today because of medical technology and healthcare and that sort of thing. But that hasn't always been true. And think about a classic example, the Atlantic cod. The Atlantic cod is a species that has an unbelievable reproductive ability. A single female can produce millions of eggs in any given growing season, okay, any given reproductive season. And she can live to be 30 years old. So she can produce millions of eggs once she becomes reproductively capable, sexually mature, and over the course of 2, potentially 3 decades, she can do that every single year. At the end of a single lifetime of a female Atlantic cod, on average, though, she has produced 2 individual offspring that grow to adulthood. Out of all those potentially tens or hundreds of millions of eggs that she's produced in all that time, 2 on average grow to adulthood, become sexually mature, and reproduce. That's a classic example of individuals producing more offspring than will survive. And you see that across the board with plants, animals, everything. Okay, it's generally true. And Darwin knew this. All right, so if resources are limiting, as Malthus said, and if there are always lots of potential offspring produced, there's not going to be enough resources for all those offspring. They all won't get enough of that resource pie to survive. Okay? If individuals vary in their characteristics, they're not all alike, and they're not, then some will, by chance alone, because of their genetic composition or whatever, be better adapted at dealing with that limited resource, getting more of it. And it's those that are better able to get more of it, the better competitors who get more of that resource, survive better and reproduce. Poor competitors don't get enough resource to be able to reproduce, therefore they don't survive. This was Darwin's aha moment, and it was On Population by Malthus that led him to this idea of natural selection. All right, so basically Darwin realized this. I'm going to write this out, sort of a series of steps, okay? This is the sort of line of reasoning that Darwin hit upon by reading Malthus's work, all right? He said that individuals will compete for limited resources. Let me just write that, for limited resources. Individuals compete for limited resources. This will then lead to some ending up being better competitors. Some end up being better competitors because all the individuals are different. They all vary in their competitive ability. Okay. This in turn means that those better competitors should end up producing more offspring. So better competitors produce more offspring, and because of heredity, which Darwin didn't really understand, as we'll see, those offspring are also going to be good competitors because they inherited that ability from their parents. This means that good or adaptive traits, right, abilities that are good to have, will accumulate in the population. It will accumulate in the population, and it also means that poor traits, those that are not adaptive, will be removed from the population. This is what Darwin called natural selection. And it's why we have things like antibiotic resistance, and it makes perfect sense, and we see evidence of it throughout nature. All right, but it took Darwin reading Malthus's book on population to realize that resources are limiting and that not everybody's going to survive, and because individuals are different, some will naturally be better at adapting to those harsh conditions than others. That's natural selection. Think of natural selection as a filter. It weeds out individuals who are not good competitors in the current environment and favors those who are. Okay, we're going to stop there for now, and we'll pick up with the second half of the chapter